Welcome, everybody. It's my special pleasure to introduce our guest today because not only is he a distinguished journalist and author, but he also is, in a way, a second-generation Silurian because, as most of us know, his mom, Marlene Sanders, was a devoted member of the Silurians, recipient of our Distinguished Achievement Award, and a wonderful lady, and we all miss her. But she was really proud of Jeff, all his achievements as a lawyer, as a prosecutor, as an author, as a television commentator, now for many years at CNN, and a staff writer for the New Yorker magazine. So he followed in his mom's footsteps as a distinguished journalist. As we know, Marlene was a pioneer, trailblazer for women in television. And we were always absolutely delighted to have her as a member of our board and a friend. Well, Jeff Toobin, in addition to all his other things, is a prolific author. He's written 7 books. The latest book, which is available here, American Heiress. By the way, it's available for only $20, which is a big discounted bargain. And that is only his 7th book, but we can look forward to more in the future. But right now, he's going to tell us a little bit about his career as a lawyer, as a journalist, as an author, and about the new book, Jeff Toobin.
Thank you, Mike. Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. My mom loved this place. She really did. I mean, it was really a second home for her. It was a time in her life where she was, after she left CBS, she was at PBS for a while, but then she was teaching at NYU for many, many years, right up until her death. And this was an opportunity to stay in touch with people who were and are in journalism. And she had tremendous affection for the place. And this was a place also where I think, the fact that women had made progress in the industry was reflected in your membership. Heroes like Betsy Wade. Where is Betsy Wade? There she is. Well, she was someone who admired you and your role, not only as a journalist, but as a plaintiff. It was, I was reminded today, my mother had many aphoristic observations about the journalism, one of which I think lives on, is that most local news anchor teams look like most men's second marriages. And that sort of usually it has to have a pause before people get that. But they all get it right away, eventually, in short order. She always brought home the Silurian news, and we've all read newsletters and employee organizations, and I just like to say personally, and I know she agreed, I think the Silurian news is absolutely great, and I always read it. Covered David Andelman and Jerry Ashkenazi. I just really think it is a remarkably fun thing and educational and a wonderful sort of episodic history of journalism in the 20th and 21st century. So what I thought I would do, I certainly want to leave plenty of time for questions, but I thought I would start by talking a little bit about American Heiress and my experience writing this book. And I thought I might begin with a question to the group, which is there anyone here who was alive in the 1970s? Is that, did we see hands? Yeah, I guess there were a few of you who knew. Well, this was the first book I wrote that was sort of at the border between journalism and history. And, though I was alive in the 70s, I didn't really have a sense before I started writing it until of just how awful the 1970s were. You know, we've heard a lot about, you know, making America great again. And it's like, I always wonder, when did he have in mind that it was so great? Because it certainly can't have been the 1970s. Here's a statistic that you know, very much sticks in my head. In the early and mid 1970s, there were 1,000 political bombings a year in the United States. Think about that. They were not all by any means fatalities, but there were 1,000 political bombings a year. Now that imagine what Fox News would do with that today. It's just hard to fathom. But I think it's indicative of the incredible social tumult that I very much associated with the 60s, but continued in many respects intensified in the 1970s. On top of that, of course, you had Watergate, you had the energy crisis, gas lines, inflation. Particularly in the Bay Area, you had an extraordinary amount of crime. You know, San Francisco in particular was afflicted with serial murderers, the Zodiac killers, the zebra killers. You know, when Warner Brothers wanted to make a detective operate in the toughest city in America, where did they put Dirty Harry? Dirty Harry was a San Francisco detective, which is a complete contrast to the San Francisco I came of age knowing, which was the glamorous, wealthy city, you know, at the edge of Silicon Valley, which of course itself did not exist in the 1970s. So when I started working on American Heiress, that was the framework of this country that was very much just about coming apart at the seams. And particularly in the Bay Area, there was a peculiar alliance that gave rise to the beginning of the story, which was the remains of the counterculture became very fixated on prisons. In particular, the possibilities for political activism among prisons and prisoners. The focus of this, at least initially, was someone who I expect many of you will remember, which was George Jackson, who was a prisoner at Soledad Prison. He wrote several books. Soledad Brother was the most famous. And there was a prison near Berkeley called Vacaville, where groups of students and recently ex-students would go to organize the prisoners and teach and sort of commune with them. And there was one prisoner in particular who became a focus of attention for these groups who visited. And his name was Donald DeFreeze. And Donald DeFreeze was a small to medium level hood, basically. He was a criminal his whole life. And he recognized that this was a route for entertainment. It was a way to meet women. There were unofficial conjugal visits involving these students who came to visit. And he started to become politicized by these students. And in 1973, he was transferred from Vacaville to Soledad Prison. And in March of 1973, he escaped from Soledad. And he went to the only place he knew he could find a welcome, which was Berkeley, and with the students who had been visiting him at Vacaville. And that return to Berkeley and the involvement of Donald DeFreeze with these students was the birth of the Symbionese Liberation Army. Now, to the extent the SLA is remembered at all, many people seem to remember it as a black revolutionary group, sort of like the Panthers. The number of African Americans in the Symbionese Liberation Army was 1. And it was never, there were never any other African Americans. They were almost all white middle-class students, and they were almost all women. You know, it was DeFreeze's idea. He had these sort of inflated, sort of Marxist, sort of Pan-Africanist ideas. And it was DeFries who came up with the idea of calling the group the Symbionese Liberation Army. Now, people ask, what does Symbionese mean? There is no country named Symbia. He thought of the alliance between students and prisoners as a symbiosis, and he created a adjective out of that, Symbionese. They didn't liberate anything or anyone, and for an army they had at most about a dozen people in their group, and that was the SLA. Now, DeFries was cooped up in his apartment in Berkeley because he was a prison escapee, and there, with these women who were surrounding him, he became obsessed with one political figure in the Bay Area in particular. His name was Marcus Foster, who was an African American who was the Oakland school superintendent, a deeply admirable figure who was trying to educate kids in a poor city in difficult circumstances. And DeFries became obsessed with the idea that Foster was a sellout and had betrayed the cause. And on November 11th, 1973, Donald DeFries and two of his followers, Nancy Ling Perry and Ms. Moon Soltysik, they ambushed Donald DeFries. They ambushed Marcus Foster outside a school board meeting and murdered him in cold blood. This was the birth of the SLA, and they sent a communique, a message bragging about their involvement. Now, what followed this period was the recruitment of a couple of new members to the SLA. And they came from that famous revolutionary hotbed, the Indiana University Theater Program. Bill and Emily Harris and a woman named Angela Atwood, they came to the Bay Area, and they had come from a period where theater, as you may remember, was considered also a political act. There was the time of guerrilla theater, and Bill and Emily and Angela, they said to DeFries, you know, we want to join with you, but maybe we should like dial it back a little bit from assassinations. Maybe we should do something that gets us a lot of publicity, but doesn't, you know, have as immediate negative repercussions. Why don't we think about kidnapping someone? And that's where the idea came, to kidnap someone. But who should they kidnap, right? That was the question. So the SLA, I'm pleased to say, were tremendous pack rats. They wrote everything down. They made these long lists, and they made lists of people that they thought were possible kidnap victims. They were mostly corporate executives in the Bay Area. One of them was Charlie Finley. I'm sure some of you remember, was the owner of the Oakland A's. How history would have been so different if they had kidnapped Charlie Finley instead of Patty Hearst. But then, in the first week in January, the San Francisco Examiner ran a engagement announcement, as it was wont to do, and it announced the engagement of Patricia Hearst, the granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, the daughter of Randy Hearst, who was the publisher of the Examiner, and Catherine Campbell Hearst, to her boyfriend Stephen Weed. And in the fourth paragraph of that engagement announcement, it said that Patricia Hearst is an undergraduate at the University of California at Berkeley. Emily Harris was a secretary at Berkeley at the time, and she knew that in that more innocent day, there was a public card catalog of the home addresses of every student at Berkeley. And so Bill Harris, her husband, went to the card catalog and he said, well, where does Patty Hearst live? And he found that she lived at 2603 Benvenue, apartment number 4. This was a nice, but certainly not exceptional apartment in a student area, but not, unlike where the corporate executives lived, there were no high walls, there were no security. And so they thought, why don't we kidnap her? What a splash that would make. So they started staking out her apartment. They saw she led a very quiet life, and they decided to kidnap her. Now, who was Patty Hearst at that time? Now, for one thing, most importantly, she was 19 years old. She was very young. And she was a Hearst. Now, I know there are a lot of newspaper folks in this room, but to be a Hearst in 1974 was very different from being a Hearst in 2016. Of course, the company is still alive and thriving, but the name had a resonance and fame in 1974 that is certainly far greater than it was today. William Randolph Hearst, the chief, the man, had died in 1951, shortly before Patricia was born, but of course it was still the family that created San Simeon. It was the family that inspired perhaps the greatest American movie ever made. I mean, there was a romance and a power to the Hearst name that the SLA, particularly the Harrises, really understood and wanted to profit off of. So on February 4th, 1974, they knocked on the door, three of them, Donald DeFreeze, Bill Harris, and Angela Atwood. They knocked on the door. Stephen Weed opened the door a crack. They burst their way in. Stephen Weed was hit on the head, and he ran out the back door and said, "Take whatever you want." And they did. They took his girlfriend, and Patricia Hearst was stuffed into the trunk of a car and driven off to a house, a safe house, where there were 8 kidnappers at that time, 9 with Patty Hearst, and they put her in a closet. And I think it's just worth pausing to recognize how terrifying and awful this experience was. This was the first and still only political kidnapping in American history. In keeping with the SLA, basically chaotic nature, they kidnapped her without knowing what their ransom demand would be. So she's sitting there in the closet, and they think, well, what are we going to do? And 2 of their members had been arrested in connection with the Marcus Foster killing, and they thought, well, maybe we'll try to arrange a trade. But even they knew that Ronald Reagan, who was governor of California at the time, was not going to trade 2 murderers in a kidnap exchange. So they thought, Bill Harris thought, let's prove that we want to do good. Let's prove that we want to use this as a force for good. Let's make Randy Hearst feed the poor of California. So they sent a demand. They said Randy Hearst has to put up $4 million, eventually $4 million, to feed the poor of California. And you know what Randy Hearst did? He did. He put up the money. They created this organization called People in Need. They rented a warehouse down right by where the San Francisco Giants play baseball now, right by the waterfront in San Francisco, and they started giving away food. They took volunteers. One of the volunteer bookkeeper who kept the books for for People in Need was a woman named Sarah Jane Moore, who would figure prominently later, and they started giving away food. It didn't work out perfectly. There were some riots at the food giveaways. But in keeping with the SLA's sort of haphazard interests, they kind of lost interest in the food giveaway. And they thought, well, now what do we do? Well, what happened then was that, Patty Hearst was put in a closet at first, but the door opened in short order. And 3 members of the SLA were assigned as her keepers. Nancy Ling Perry, who was sort of their propagandist, Angela Atwood, who was from Indiana, an actress. She had just recently been in a community theater production of Hedda Gabler, and Willie Wolfe. Now, Willie Wolfe was the SLA member who was closest in age and background to Patty Hearst. He was a prep school kid. He grew up, his father was a physician in New Milford, Connecticut. He'd gone to prep school, he'd gone to Berkeley, he was studying to be an archaeologist, and the 2 of them hit it off. They developed a rapport. Now, the precise degree of their relationship remains disputed to this day, but there is no question that there developed a rapport between Willie Wolfe and Patty Hearst. At the same time, Patty Hearst, at this moment, at her 19-year-old self, was at a crossroads in her own life. She was engaged to Stephen Weed, but she couldn't stand the guy. She was very unhappy. Having met and interviewed Stephen Weed, I kind of get that. So she was unhappy with him. She had a very contentious relationship with her mother, which is not exactly an uncommon thing for 19-year-olds in any era, but particularly in the 1970s. And so she was at a restless and uncertain moment, and Willie Wolfe was nice to her and started talking to her about politics and started telling her, as the other SLA members did, that her father was nickel and diming them about this food giveaway. And in relatively short order, she started to change. She started to become sympathetic to the SLA, and on March 31st, just 7 weeks after she was kidnapped, she sent her own communique, a tape where she said in a famous phrase, "I have decided to stay and fight," and her name, all the SLA did. Donald DeFreeze called himself General Field Marshal Sin-Q, as you may remember. Willie Wolfe called himself Cujo, and Patty Hearst said, "I am going to be called Tanya," as I bet a lot of you remember. And that name had a special resonance because Tanya was the nom de guerre of the East German woman who was Che Guevara's partner in the jungles in Bolivia when they were both killed. So it had a particular resonance. Well, at that point, their priorities changed, but they had a common problem. They needed money. They were running out of money. The Hearst money didn't go to them, and so in the best Willie Sutton tradition, they went where the money was. They decided to rob a bank, but they wanted to pick a bank in particular with a new security feature in 1974. They wanted to find a bank with a security camera like that, because not all banks did in those days, and they found one in a quiet part of San Francisco in the Sunset section, the Hibernia Bank, and on March 15th, March 15th. No, it was April 15th. It was April 15th. They robbed the bank, and they assigned Patty Hearst to stand where they knew the camera was pointed, because they wanted to show off the photo that she was on the team, and so their famous photograph of her holding the machine gun. But to celebrate their success, they got about $11,000. They decided to do a portrait of Patty Hearst in full regalia in front of a flag, the SLA flag, which was a 7-headed cobra, and it was just a single Polaroid shot shortly after the bank robbery. And that photograph, which can be yours for $20 in the bank, I say in the book, became, not facetiously, like the Mona Lisa of the 1970s. Because that photograph, that incredible photograph of her, her expression is completely inscrutable. I challenge you to look at the photograph. You can't tell. Is she happy? Is she sad? Is she scared? Is she exultant? Is she proud? Is she appalled? It's a mysterious photograph which became an iconic image of the 1970s. Now, April 15th, the heat starts to get really great. In San Francisco, the mayor is outraged, and DeFreeze says, "You know what? We got to get out of here. We got to go to Los Angeles, where DeFreeze was from and where he sort of knew the terrain better." So the 9 of them, the 8 original kidnappers and their new recruit, they get in 3 cars, 3 groups of 3, and they drive to Los Angeles. And they rent a small house in South Central Los Angeles, and they sit there. And they don't know what to do, because they never know what to do. They never have any plan, and they start to go stir crazy. So on May 16th, they decide to go shopping. What's what people do when they're bored in the United States, right? So 3 of them go shopping. Bill and Emily Harris and Patricia Hearst, they go out. They go to a grocery store, they go to a newsstand, and then the three of them go to a place called Mel's Sporting Goods, where they are going to buy some clothes. And Mel's Sporting Goods is on a busy street in Inglewood. It's across 4 lanes, and Bill and Emily park their van. They have a van, and they park it in a little lot across 4 lanes of traffic from Mel's. And they leave Patricia Hearst in the car by herself. Key ignition. What does she do? She does nothing. She waits. Does she drive the car away? Does she call home? Does she call the police? No, she waits. And Bill and Emily Harris go inside Mel's Sporting Goods. And they go to buy a few things. But then Bill, because he's a genius, decides to shoplift. And Anthony Shepard, who was the clerk in Mel's Sporting Goods, is an aspiring police officer. And he knows that the crime of shoplifting does not take place until the perpetrator physically leaves the premises. So he sees Bill stuffing socks and a bandolier into his pockets, but then doesn't do anything until Bill leaves the store. But once he leaves the store, Anthony Shepard tackles him. Emily Harris jumps on top of Anthony Shepard. Bystanders jump in. There's this incredible melee in front of Mel's Sporting Goods with Patricia Hearst across the street in the van. What does she do, right? Does she drive away? Does she do nothing? No. She goes into the back of the van and gets a machine gun, points it out the window, and empties a magazine of bullets to free Bill and Emily Harris across the facade of Mel's Sporting Goods, miraculously not hurting anyone. Doesn't work. What does she do then? She gets a different machine gun and does the same thing, firing across the street, again not hitting anyone, but this time it works. And Bill and Emily manage to escape, jump into the van, and they drive away. Now they recognize the first thing that they need to do is get rid of this van because a lot of people have seen it. And, you know, it drew a lot of attention when you shoot up machine guns on busy streets in Los Angeles. So they stop and they see a sign in a van on the street, van for sale. And a young man named Tom Matthews comes out and says, they knock on the door and say, "Can we drive your van?" And he said, and they say, "Okay, you know, but I have to come with you." And they say, "Okay." So he gets in the van with the three of them. They take a machine gun out and say, "Well, we're taking your van and we're taking you." And Tom Matthews says, "Well, that's okay, just as long as I'm back in time for my high school baseball game tomorrow." And they head out. They have a fallback position with their comrades. They go to a drive-in movie. They're supposed to meet there. They watch the New Centurions, but they don't meet up their friends. In any event, they realize they have to get out of town. They leave Tom Matthews to go to his baseball game, which he wins 1-0. And Emily remembers that she's had a summer job at a place where they could probably hide pretty well. Emily says to Bill and Patricia, the three of them are on the road, they says, "Why don't we go to Disneyland?" So the three of them go to Disneyland, and they check in to a motel across the street from Disneyland, and they turn on the television. Now, what has happened in the early 1970s is that something has happened in the media business, in the business we all work in, that the television minicam has just been invented. There had been live television broadcasts before the 70s, but they involved laying cable in advance, you know, for a World Series game or a political convention. But the minicam allowed breaking news to be broadcast live. And so KNXT, which later came to be called KCBS, had sent one of its first trucks to 54th Street where the house was. And Bill and Emily and Patricia turn on the television to see the confrontation. And there is a loudspeaker, and the LAPD says, come out with your hands up, we have you surrounded. The 6 remaining SLA members are inside the house, and that request is met with gunfire from inside the house. What follows is, to this day, the biggest gun battle involving the police in American history. 5,000 rounds of ammunition go into the house. 3,000 rounds of ammunition come out of the house. Ultimately, the tear gas that is sent into the house ignites the house, and all 6 members of the SLA inside the house are killed. Bill, Donald DeFreeze, Willie Wolfe, Patricia, Ms. Munsell-Tiesick, Nancy Ling Perry, and of course Willie Wolfe, are all killed on live television while Patricia, Bill, and Emily are watching, and the whole world is watching. Now that's May 17th, 1974. Patricia is not caught, and the group is not caught until September of 1975. During that year, she is on the lam for a year. It is one of the most incompetent and appallingly ridiculous FBI investigations in history, where they hire psychics. But again, one of the J. Edgar Hoover had only died in 1972, so it was still very much J. Edgar Hoover's FBI in 1974 and 1975, which meant that the FBI was thousands of guys in crew cuts and black shoes who found it difficult to infiltrate the counterculture, you'll be shocked to know. And so it was difficult for them to sort of figure out what was going on. During that year, Patty Hearst becomes a full-fledged member of the SLA. They rob 2 more banks. In the 3rd bank robbery in Sacramento, a woman is killed, Myrna Opsal, who is arriving with the church offerings of her Seventh-day Adventist church to deposit them, is killed by a blast from Emily Harris's shotgun. They start setting off bombs, as one did in the 70s. It is not until September of 1975 that they are caught, after having been sheltered by a group, by sort of a second SLA group, led in part by Jack Scott, Ira Burko's friend, who was a very interesting guy, sports activist, who tried, whose idea was, I know if I get the SLA, the thing I'm going to do is we're all going to write a book together, and we'll make millions. And he actually installed them in a farmhouse in Pennsylvania to get them to write a book. You probably won't be shocked to learn that the book writing thing didn't work out so well. And it was after the Pennsylvania farmhouse thing collapsed that they went back to California and robbed more banks. And 1975, she's tried for the original bank robbery. Well, first of all, she's arrested on September 15th, and she is booked at the station house, as people are, and she has to give her pedigree information, name, address, occupation, and she's asked her occupation, and she says urban guerrilla, which was accurate. That was her occupation, and I was able to get letters that she wrote to her comrades right after she was arrested, and it was all about how we are going to continue leading the revolution and overthrow the fascist regime in America, AMERIKKKA, in her sort of private girls' school handwriting. That's where she was when she was arrested. But F. Lee Bailey is hired by her family, and F. Lee Bailey says, we're not doing this anymore. And Patricia, who was no dummy, she recognized that this whole revolutionary thing was not working out for her anymore. And in short order, she decided that she was back in the Hearst fold, and she had been coerced to join the SLA, and that was the defense at her trial, where she was convicted and sentenced to 7 years in prison. But her family organized a drive to get Jimmy Carter, the president at the time, to issue her a commutation, to let her out of prison before she served the full 7 years. Ronald Reagan supported this effort. He was an old friend of the Hearst family. But the turning point in the effort to get a commutation for Patty Hearst was another example of San Francisco madness. Just as Jimmy Carter was weighing whether to give you commutation, the Reverend Jim Jones brought his followers to Guyana, 900 of them, and as I'm sure you all remember, they committed mass suicide there. And the whole country was asking the question, what could compel anyone to act so much against self-interest? And that was Patty Hearst's position, that she had been compelled to act against self-interest, and Jimmy Carter did issue the commutation. But that wasn't enough for Patricia or the Hearst family. 20 years later, subsequently she has led a quiet life in the New York suburbs. She married her bodyguard, Bernie Shaw. He became, shockingly, the head of security at the Hearst Corporation. And towards the end of Bill Clinton's presidency, the Hearst family decided, you know, it's not enough that she got a commutation. We want her to get a pardon, too. And on the last day of Bill Clinton's presidency, the same day that he pardoned Mark Rich and Roger Clinton, he gave Patty Hearst a full pardon. Patty Hearst is the only person in modern American history to receive a commutation from one president and a pardon from another, which, if you want a lesson in the value of wealth and privilege in America, that's a good one right there. Anyway, that's a introduction to my story, and wasn't it nice to have like 20 minutes where you didn't have to think about Donald Trump at all? So I'm happy to take any sort of questions you have. Yes, sir.
All right.
I'll repeat them if people can.
Patty Hearst did not talk to you.
No, she did not.
Did you try hard?
Well, you know, I tried incredibly hard to get Patty Hearst to talk to me. I wrote, I called, I had intermediaries, and we did speak once. I can actually recount the conversation. Because I said, I had a phone number for her. I called and she answered, and I said, "Hi, Patricia. This is Jeff Toobin. Oh God, click." So I was getting all these mixed signals. Look, she's moved on in her life. She had, one of the sort of great things about, also what was fun about writing this book is that, I had no axe to grind here. I didn't, went into this story with no preconceived notions. I wasn't out to get Patty Hearst. I just sort of led where the facts took me. But, the incredible thing about her story is that she led the life for which she was destined. She's a rich lady in the suburbs. The whole thing was like the junior year abroad from hell. She doesn't want to talk about it anymore. Fortunately, she wrote a book. She'd given other interviews. She's given a series of interviews almost exclusively to people who don't know much about the facts of the case.
She's read the book?
We're all a certain level of cynicism here. Well, I sent it to her, and I was so hoping she would threaten to sue me or something, because you know how the publicity that would have been. No, she retained a respectful sign. And look, I have no, anger. It's like, this was a long time ago, and but I wanted to tell as accurate a story as I could.
Jeff, tell us
Mr.
why you picked that subject to write about.
Well, there's sort of a specific answer to that. I did a story for the New Yorker, I don't know, I guess it must be about three or 4 years ago, about this jail in Baltimore that had been taken over by this gang called the Black Guerrilla Family, and there were these women guards, and the prisoners were sleeping with the guards, and it was this whole saga. But I got interested in the history of the Black Guerrilla Family, which it turned out was founded was founded by George Jackson in the 70s. And that led me to being interested in the prison movement, and which I discussed at the beginning. And I was having lunch with, and I knew the SLA came out of it, and I had lunch with my editor at Doubleday, Bill Thomas, and he said, well, what about Patty Hearst? And I said, well, there must be 1 million books about Patty Hearst. And he said, well, go see. And I saw that no journalist had written about Patty Hearst for decades. I mean, the story was just waiting there. And that's where I...
Yeah, hi. Question from the Peanut Gallery.
Yes.
Jeff, you sort of depicted this operation in the book as a sort of gang that couldn't shoot straight. Is this what you thought when you started, or is this what you came up with?
You know, I guess I should say somewhat proudly, I didn't think much. I mean, I barely knew, I knew the SLA had kidnapped him, but I did not... Her, sorry, thank you. I didn't know. I mean, I really knew very little about the SLA, and I think they were a kind of gang that couldn't shoot straight. Fortunately, if they had shot straight, do you know how many dead people there would be? I mean, they shot their guns at the kidnapping on February 4th. They shot their guns at the bank robbery in May, in April. They shot their guns at Mel Sporting Goods. The only person they killed was Marcus Foster and later Myrna Opsahl. And so, I mean, I just think, I spoke to the ones who survive, and they pretty much acknowledged that, to put it charitably, it was an improvisation as they moved along. Yes, Lynn?
I have a question and then a little follow-up about your mother. The men who were arrested with Patty Hearst, what sentences did they get? Where are they now?
Well, there were 3 people arrested the same day: Bill and Emily Harris, and Steve Solia and Patricia. Steve was her. There is some dispute about whether Willie Wolfe and Patricia had a relationship. There's no doubt that Steve Solia and Patricia did. They were living together. They were a couple. Let me just as my father, known to many of you, like to say, to make a long story unbearable, Steve Solia was charged with the bank robbery where Myrna Opsahl was killed in Sacramento. He was charged with being inside the bank as one of the gunmen. He was not. He was one of the lookouts. And there was an incredibly dramatic moment where during his trial, it was in federal court in Sacramento, when someone walked in and the jury and everyone went, because this person I looked just like Steve Solia, and he was a customer in the bank. It was mistaken identity, and he was acquitted. And Steve Solia never was prosecuted at all for anything, and he died a little while ago, in his 60s. Bill and Emily Harris were arrested, and they served about 6 years for Patricia's kidnapping. Many years later, the investigation of the Carmichael Bank, where Myrna Opsahl was killed, was reopened, and they served another 7 years for that. Bill Harris, the two of them got divorced. As you can imagine, this put a lot of stress on their relationship. He became a private investigator during his period, and actually, from all accounts, quite a good one. And he was a pack rat. And one of his projects was he wanted to assemble everything in connection with the SLA, all the trials. He got 150 boxes of material. And he was about to sell them to a university library, and the deal fell through when I met him, and I bought those 150 boxes. And that was the key research evidence. And now I am giving them all to Harvard Law School.
Well, it actually segues into my final question about your mother, whom we admired and really was a great friend to many of us. She probably has an archive. I would assume there's an archive.
Yes.
Where will that archive go?
Well, it's actually oddly, for reasons I never quite understood, the Wisconsin Historical Society asked for her archive many years ago. So she all through the last 20 years of her life was sending stuff to Wisconsin. So most of it's there. The Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe has some of her papers, as I don't understand exactly the distinction, but it's mostly there. And I just want to say thank you for having me, but also thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about my mother and how much I loved her and how proud I was that she was my mom. And I will be happy to sign your books. Thanks for coming.
Somebody else? Money? You got it already. Books.
And
this to
I'm taking the money.